Self-realization is your birthright. Everybody should be self-realized. You should know who you are. That really is a fundamental thing that everybody should have. So, um, if that sounds of interest to you, then you're in the right place, and we'll proceed from here. So, as I said, today I'd like to share with you something about the structure of yourself. Why is this important? Because if you don't know about your structure, then you're going to have a very difficult time with self-mastery. So self-mastery is part and parcel of self-realization. Self-realization, as I said, is to know who you are and to know your powers and your relationship with reality. So that means you have to know about your own structure, your internal structure. You have to know about how nature is organized. So otherwise, you're just going to be in the dark. You're going to be feeling powerless much of the time. And if you just take inventory, you'll probably notice that a lot of the time you do feel powerless. So you might feel empowered up to a point, but then there will be certain conditions in your life. And when those conditions are met, then you feel powerless all of a sudden. So you might feel powerful when you're in your element, but then when the conditions change, then you will feel powerless. And that's not something that you really want to be struggling with in your life, because that, as I've said, that produces a lot of fear and distress in your life. And that's not what you really want. So having knowledge of your structure is really helpful for clarifying this. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. A lot of people don't realize that they have a structure. But this is, again, one of those things that if you don't realize that you have a structure, then you're going to be really struggling in life. Many of you may be familiar with a person named Ramana Maharshi. And Ramana is very well known for a particular form of self-inquiry using the question, who am I? People who have investigated using this form of self-inquiry where they ask, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And this can be very powerful, but unfortunately, it's often overly complicated because we can really simplify things. And that's what I intend to do here. So we can actually systematically investigate ourselves so that we can systematically answer that question, who am I? So the first thing to understand is that, and I want to actually, in a moment, I'm going to give you a guided, practical exploration of this so you can actually experience this directly for yourself, because that's very important. The knowledge alone does not make any change. You actually have to directly experience it. But I'm going to briefly give you some knowledge and then we'll actually directly explore it together. Okay. But the first thing to understand is that your life consists of a lot of content. So right now I'm speaking. I notice some people are saying they can't hear, but most of you I think can hear. At least I'm seeing that there is some audio coming across. So there's sound happening. You're hearing something. Okay, so that hearing is part of the content. The sound is part of the content. We can't really separate hearing from sound. They go together. Okay, so I will use hearing and sound interchangeably in the sense that they're both referring to content. And similarly, we have our other senses. So you're seeing, and there's what is being seen. And then maybe you might be smelling things, maybe you might be tasting things, you might be also having tactile sensory input as well. Okay. So all of that is the content. There's content happening. And if you observe your experience very carefully, you'll see that that's the entirety of the content. I have often suggested that thought is another element of content, but if you're actually really carefully observant, you'll notice that thought is not separate from the other sensory data. So if you notice, how are you aware of thought? And you cannot be aware of thought except through your senses. So you might be hearing it subtly within yourself. You might be seeing it. You might be feeling it. But I guess in some cases, you might be tasting or smelling the thought. But apart from that sensory data, you cannot have a thought. All thought is structured in that sensory data. So your actual experience consists of content, and that content is sensory data, which is an amazing thing if you actually consider this for a moment, that your entire experience is constructed of these five senses. It's impossible for you to have some other experience apart from these five senses. This is a powerful insight that's also an ancient insight. So if you were to, there are certain ancient scriptures, I would say actually all ancient scriptures make reference to this. Some of them make it explicitly. They explicitly state that apart from the five senses, which are often associated with five elements, so the five elements and the five senses are synonyms, that there is nothing else of this reality. This reality consists only of those things. So your entire experience consists only of those things. So the content level of yourself consists of those five things, which are arranged and associated in an infinite variety of ways, constructing all of the various experiences that you have. But just observe that in your life, and you'll notice it's very powerful to notice that there's never anything in your life that does not consist of those five things. It's never anything outside of that. So that's the content level. So content level consists of five elements, five senses. Now, the content is always changing, right? So the sound is changing, what you're seeing is changing, the smells are changing, the tastes are changing, the feelings are changing, it's all changing. So you can't be exclusively the content, because if you were exclusively the content, how would you be aware of the content? You would have no stable reference point from which to observe it. So there would actually be no you in that equation at all. But there is a you that's aware of the content, right? There's actually a reference, there's a stable reference point, a stable point of view. Now there are many intermediate points of view. I'll get to that in a moment, but there's a single stable point of view. There's one point of view that's unchanging. Has to be, because if that was not the case, as I said, if you were that which is changing, if you were exclusively that which is changing, then you would not actually be able to have any awareness of anything. So there has to be a stable point of view, stable reference point. So at the highest level, you are that. And this is what many masters are referring to when they're talking about, when they're pointing to who are you and inviting you to recognize who you are. The invitation then is to recognize that you are that ultimate, stable, unchanging reference point. So that's what that invitation is. So when Ramana is saying, who am I? It's to go through all of the content until finally there's a realization that who I am at the highest level, at the most fundamental level, is that which is changeless, that which is formless, that which is none of the content. So that is at the highest level. And I'm using that term highest level just to define this in some way, but it's not absolutely true that it's higher. We could understand it as lower. We could call it fundamental. But the point is that there is a structure, there's a relationship. And I'm just using the term higher, but you can understand it in whatever way you want. But the point is, again, there's a structure. So that highest level, that absolute level, is unchanging, formless. And it is true that you are that. But it's also true that you are the totality. Because everything, actually, all the five senses, all of that content emerges from that same formless awareness. And this is all somewhat theoretical at this point, but in a moment, I'm going to guide you so that you can actually directly experience this for yourself. And then once you've had that experience, then we'll take this a little bit further so that you can I'm going to actually give you some suggestions for things that you can do, that you can explore in your life, that will allow you to better organize the content so that you can be more successful and happier in your life. Because self-mastery is about the total self. It's about having total self-knowledge, total self-awareness, and being able to organize the content in a way that is harmonious and aligned with your true desires. So this is another important point because a lot of the time people are making this mistake of thinking, well, if only I can have this realization of myself as that absolute self, of that transcendent self, of that formless self, that's going to solve all my problems. And sorry to have to be the one to break it to you. It doesn't work that way. That will not work out in the way that you might be fantasizing. So people are often pursuing, they think, well, if only I can achieve this enlightenment thing, then everything's going to be great. Then my relationships will be great, my finances will be great, my health will be great, and everything's going to be fine then. I can just achieve this magical enlightenment thing. Well, it depends really what you're how you're defining enlightenment, but most people don't define it at all. But what they're vaguely imagining is that if they can just achieve this awareness or recognition of themselves as formless awareness, as that transcendent self, then somehow that's going to sort everything out. And rarely will that actually happen. In fact, oftentimes it will be the opposite. It will make things, it will make the rest of your life, uh, in some ways, more difficult because then you'll stop caring, except you'll still care. You'll care, but not care at the same time. And that's a very difficult position to be in. So, from my perspective, it's better to actually have total self knowledge, have the knowledge so that you can actually start to organize the content in a better way alongside with having the recognition of yourself as that formless transcendent self. Both should go together. If they don't go together, then it's going to be very difficult. So if you want to go live in a cave in the Himalayas or elsewhere, and that's your path and you're committed to that, and you're seriously willing to give up on the finances and the relationships and all the rest of it, then you're always welcome to do that. But understand that that's a different path and that that path involves renouncing the world. But if you're not going to do that, if you're actually intending to stay in this world, then I promise you, you're going to be much happier and better off if you have an understanding of the structure and you organize that structure in a way that is harmonious and aligned with your values and your goals and your desires. Then, alongside that, also have the transcendent self-awareness. Both should go together. If you're trying to separate them, then it's not likely to work out very well for you. I'm speaking from experience.